This is your final exam review for the Psychology 2301 Departmental Final, Part 2, Chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 is Biological Psychology. This deals with the interaction between brain, body, and behavior. Objective number 1 in this section asks that you be able to identify the basic components of a neuron. A neuron is a nerve cell whose primary purpose is to transmit and receive neural impulses from other nerve cells. The receiving part of the neuron is a dendrite or dendrites. These are branching fibers which receive information. You can see in the picture there. The cell body or soma is the nucleus which keeps the cell alive. The axon is the part of the neuron which transmits information to another neuron. We'll return to Objective 2 in just a moment, but Objective 3 asks that you define an action potential and explain the processes that occur when a neuron is activated. Electrical transmission within a neuron is the way in which messages are transmitted. In its resting state, the resting potential, the neuron has a negative charge because there are more negative ions on the inside. No signal is being transmitted at that point. When electrical activity is stimulated within the neuron, in other words, a message is being transmitted, this is described as an action potential. There's a brief electrical impulse when the positive ions rush inside the neuron. When the electrical impulse reaches the end of the axon, the junction or gap between neurons is known as a synapse. Objective number 2 asks you to identify the basic components of the synapse. As the electrical impulse moves along the axon, it finally reaches the terminal buttons at the end of an axon where neurotransmitter chemicals are produced. These chemicals will cross the gap or junction between neurons and be received by the receptor sites on the dendrites of the next neuron. These neurotransmitters that are produced by the axon terminal buttons and received by the dendrites, the receptor sites on the dendrites, affect learning, memory, mood, behavior, and are also seen as the root of some mental illnesses. Objective number 4 asks you to explain how neurotransmitters affect behavior and identify the major neurotransmitters. A few of them are listed on the slide below. The effects of the major neurotransmitters are as follows. Acetylcholine affects memory, sleep, and is implicated in Alzheimer's disease. Dopamine is a pleasure neurotransmitter. It also affects learning, emotion, motivation, and movement, and is implicated in the development of schizophrenia. Serotonin affects your mood, appetite, sleep, and is implicated in the development of depression. Norepinephrine is the stress hormone, also implicated in learning and in terms of disorders, attention deficit disorder, and depression. The endorphins are known as endogenous pain relievers, sort of the body's own morphine, and therefore are implicated in the development of drug addiction. Moving on to objective number 5, you're asked to identify the medulla and the cerebellum and describe their functions. The medulla is part of the brain stem, which is considered to be the old brain. These are the functions that existed even in prehistoric times and in more primitive species. The brain stem controls breathing, attention, and the basic functions. It's the innermost part of the brain and therefore is most protected. The medulla in particular controls breathing and heart rate. The cerebellum, which is located at the bottom back of the brain, controls voluntary movement. It's located behind the brain stem and therefore is still somewhat protected, although a blow to that part of the body can interrupt movement or make the person disabled in terms of their ability to coordinate or balance. Objective number 6 asks that you list the processes regulated by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus controls some of the more primitive motivations, including hunger, thirst, and sexuality, or sexual motivation. It also links the nervous system to the endocrine system, which we'll talk about later, via the pituitary gland, and thus the glands or hormones that are implicated in sexuality and in digestion. Objective 7 asks that you describe the limbic system and list the responses and behaviors affected by it. In particular, two parts of the limbic system, the hippocampus and the amygdala, are going to be important in understanding psychological processes. I was taught that if you saw a hippo on campus, that you would certainly remember it. That's a mnemonic device used to remember what the hippocampus is for, which is memory formation. The amygdala is in control of the more emotional parts of your memory, including aggression, fear, emotions, and stress. Emotional memories seem to be relayed directly from the amygdala. It's connected to the sympathetic nervous system and therefore, as we'll see later, is in control of your stress response. Objective number 8 asks that you describe the components of the cerebrum and their functions. The cerebrum consists of the cerebral cortex and the corpus callosum. The cerebral cortex is the outermost part of your brain and is responsible for thinking and language, in other words, the more human functions. The corpus callosum connects the right and left hemisphere of your brain so that the functions of the two brains are coordinated and communication is possible between the two. The cerebral hemispheres in most people are responsible for separate functions, although that separation is usually not noticed because of the corpus callosum, which permits ongoing communication. In most people, who are mostly right-handed, the right cerebral the right cerebral hemisphere is responsible for perceptual skills, drawing pictures, and some types of emotional responses. The left hemisphere is responsible for the more academic functions, logic, language, and math. Objective 9 asks that you explain the functions of the frontal lobes, and in particular lists one disorder, Broca's aphasia, that exists because of damage here. The frontal lobes control thinking, planning, judgment, and impulse control. Broca's area is in the left frontal lobe and is responsible for the production of language. Broca's aphasia results when there's damage to that left frontal lobe, and subsequently there's a loss of speech or some of the speech functions. The association areas are responsible for sensory and motor information being combined. They're also associated with stored knowledge or memories. The motor cortex is responsible for movement, and it sends signals to the spinal cord and the cerebellum so that those movements can be coordinated throughout the body. Objective number 10 asks you to describe the various methods for studying the brain and its functions. Several of these methods are listed on the slide. The electroencephalograph, or EEG, is used by attaching electrodes to the outside of the skull and monitoring brainwave patterns. The CAT scan, which is computerized axial tomography, is a series of X-rays that allow you to visualize a cross-sectional image of the brain. It's basically a static image, but you can see damage that's occurred to various tissues. Magnetic resonance imaging, the MRI, allows you to identify tissue types and again see a tumor perhaps or some type of damage in the brain. The functional MRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging, allows you to get a more active picture of what's going on in the brain as the magnetic field monitors ongoing activity. Positron emission tomography monitors a decay of radioactive material, generally glucose, and is used to visualize what's going on inside the brain in real time. This visualization is possible because you are watching as the radioactive glucose decays and the brain uses the nutrients to think or process information. Objective number 11 asks you to explain the difference between the central and the peripheral nervous system. As the name suggests, the central nervous system is in the center of the body and consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain and spinal cord are responsible for responding to incoming information after interpreting and processing the signals that it receives from the peripheral nervous system. In return, as they respond to this information, they send signals to the peripheral nervous system, the outside nervous system, to control body movements. The peripheral nervous system is composed of the autonomic and the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for automatic functions, things like digestion, heart rate, breathing, things that go on without voluntary control. The somatic nervous system is responsible for controlling voluntary muscle groups like your arms and legs, body movements. Basically, the peripheral nervous system is going to link the central nervous system to the body's sense receptors, muscles, and glands. The autonomic nervous system, which is part of the peripheral nervous system, can be further subdivided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system is the nervous system that's activated when you're under stress or facing an emergency situation. A sympathetic response is going to activate the organs and glands and is sometimes called the fight, flight, or stress response. This is what happens when you might experience a sudden emergency. Perhaps you're almost in a car accident and all of a sudden you can feel your heart rate accelerating, your breathing gets very rapid. Your digestion actually stops at this point because the blood flow needs to be to more important parts of your body, which would enable you to flee or to fight the stress that your body's going to be experiencing. The parasympathetic nervous system allows you to calm yourself down or recover from this stress after the emergency is finished. Plasticity refers to the capacity of the brain to change its structure or function in response to experience or damage. Subsequent to a trauma, for example, a person may have injured his Broca's area or perhaps the cerebellum and find himself unable to speak or unable to walk. Those capacities can be regenerated either in the same area of the brain, or they may learn, for example, to control speech in a slightly different area of the brain. Particularly young children are able to redevelop capacities in different parts of their brain, but even the elderly who suffered a stroke, for example, might learn to walk again in the process of rehabilitation. The brain, therefore, is now considered to be plastic. Not everything could be corrected or cured, but there is some ability to regain function and some ability to use a different structure in the brain for the same capacity. Knowledge of the endocrine system is also important to understanding human behavior. Objective number 14 asks you to describe the ways in which the endocrine system, pituitary gland, and adrenal gland affect behavior. The endocrine system is composed of a variety of glands interconnected in a system that help you control your behavior and affect your mood and responses. These glands secrete hormones. Hormones are generally created within the body, although they can be replaced artificially if your body's not producing enough. Hormones are basically chemical messengers that exist in the bloodstream rather than in the nervous system, and the hormones help regulate your emotions and behaviors. A variety of these glands and the hormones they produce are shown on the slide above. The pituitary is known as the master gland. The pituitary secretes a variety of hormones which affect other glands in the body. The pituitary is directly connected to the hypothalamus in the brain, which initiates activity in the pituitary. The adrenal glands are one of the more important glands for psychology because the adrenal glands are largely responsible for the fight-flight response. This is the response in which you respond to stress. It's also implicated in anxiety. The production of adrenaline is also related to disorders such as attention deficit disorder and depression. Section number 3 deals with learning. Objective number 1, define and identify examples of learning. Your textbook defines learning as a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge resulting from experience. Examples of learning are everything from simple association learning, classical conditioning, like learning to be afraid of dogs because you were bitten, to more complex cognitive learning that you're engaged in during this class. The earliest type of learning described by psychologists was classical conditioning, also known as learning by association. Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist, first described this type of learning during his project studying digestive processes in dogs. Pavlov discovered that the dogs began to salivate not just when presented with food, but also when they heard the attendant who fed them coming down the hallway. Pavlov substituted a noise for the attendant and tried presenting the noise each time before the dogs were fed, finding that they very quickly learned to associate the noise with being fed, and they would begin to salivate when they heard that noise. The noise was initially a neutral stimulus, not producing any particular response. It became associated with the stimulus that produced the reflexive behavior, in this case, food. And so the Pavlov's dog learned to produce that reflexive behavior when they were confronted with the noise. Watson found the same thing worked with the baby called Little Albert when he used a sudden loud noise and associated it with a rat. We'll talk about that more in just a few minutes. Understanding terminology is important in an explanation of classical conditioning. Objective number 2 asks you to explain the process through which classical conditioning modifies an organism's response to stimuli. If you notice, there are quite a few key terms under this objective. The first key term you need to understand is an unconditioned stimulus. An unconditioned stimulus, US or UCS in abbreviated form, produces a response naturally. The naturally occurring response is called an unconditioned response. The unconditioned stimulus producing an unconditioned response is known as a reflex. It's an innate behavior pattern. Food, when put inside your mouth, automatically causes salivation. It's a reflex. A puff of air to the eye causes an eye blink response. A sudden loud noise to an infant causes a startle response. These are just some examples of reflexive responses. A neutral stimulus is something which becomes associated with an unconditioned stimulus, and through the process of association takes on the same productive value as the unconditioned stimulus, so that now the noise, the bell, for Pavlov's dog, after having been associated with the unconditioned stimulus, the food, now comes on its own to produce the unconditioned response, which is now called a conditioned response, that of salivation. So now you find that for Pavlov's dog, ringing a bell produces salivation. Learning is said to have occurred when the conditioned stimulus can now produce a conditioned response or learned response on its own. Let's work through this example with Little Albert. Watson used an unconditioned stimulus, a sudden loud noise, to produce an unconditioned response, a fear response, in Little Albert. The neutral stimulus that Watson used was a rat. After pairing the rat with the unconditioned stimulus, the loud noise, the little boy, Albert, learned to respond to the rat as a conditioned stimulus with a fear response or a conditioned response. Now we've basically covered objective number 3, which was summarize the contributions of Pavlov and Watson to the study of learning. Both contributed their classic studies, Pavlov's dogs, Watson's study with Little Albert, that demonstrated, first of all, that classical conditioning could occur, and secondly, the effect of classical conditioning on humans. There are some additional important terms to learn in reference to classical conditioning. Stimulus generalization refers to the process in which the organism learns to respond to a similar neutral stimulus as if it were the conditioned stimulus. For example, Little Albert wasn't just afraid of white furry rats. He was also afraid of white bunny rabbits, white Santa Claus masks, white furry rugs, etc. He had generalized from the initial stimulus, the rat, to other similar stimuli. Stimulus discrimination is said to occur when the organism learns to respond differently to similar stimuli. For example, you could train an individual to respond only to the specific stimuli you present, like the rat, by selectively providing the loud noise only to the rat, and then providing either a counter response like relaxation or no unconditioned stimulus when the rat or the Santa Claus masks were presented. Therefore, the subject would learn to discriminate between those two stimuli. Extinction occurs when the unconditioned stimulus is removed and the conditioned stimulus is maintained. For example, if the rat was presented repeatedly without the sudden loud noise, eventually little Albert would lose his fear. This is the way in which phobias are extinguished in people who come to therapy. In this case, a conditioned response gradually declines as the unconditioned stimulus is removed. In the case of people in therapy, they're presented with the stimulus without the painful consequences. And finally, spontaneous recovery occurs after the process of extinction, when a period of time passes and again the conditioned stimulus is presented, and rather than being extinguished, you'll see a slight or a smaller response than you had initially to that conditioned stimulus. For example, after 6 months had passed, little Albert had been extinguished or lost his fear of rats. Now, if you presented him the rat, he would have that same response again, only to a lesser degree, and he would show some fear of the rat. Objective number 4 asks you to explain the process through which operant conditioning modifies an organism's response to stimuli. Whereas classical conditioning works with reflexive behaviors, operant conditioning works with voluntary behaviors. For voluntary behaviors, the frequency that they will occur in the future. Reinforcement, or a reinforcer, is anything which increases the frequency of a behavior. Reinforcers are going to vary from one person to the next. Not everyone is satisfied or pleased by the same type of consequence. Punishment is anything which suppresses a behavior. Again, punishment is going to be varied from individual to individual. What some individuals regard as punishment, other individuals may not be particularly bothered by. A third objective in this section, it's objective number 5, is define shaping. Shaping is the gradual process through which reinforcement to successive approximations to the target behavior allows one to learn a more complex voluntary behavior. For example, in learning to play the piano, you don't wait until your child is playing Mozart before you reinforce them. Instead, you initially reinforce them for listening to music, then for playing simple scales, then for Mary Had a Little Lamb, until finally you're reserving your reinforcement for complex behaviors like playing an entire song, perhaps even classical music. Some of the key terms for operant conditioning are similar to those in classical conditioning, but the meaning may vary slightly. Extinction still refers to a process in which learning is lost or disappears. In the case of operant conditioning, you lose the learning by removing reinforcers, and a behavior decreases. For example, most of you, if you work for a paycheck. If one day you went to work and didn't get paid, and the next, and the next, and the next, if the reinforcement was removed, most of you would not continue going to work. Without the reinforcer, payment, the behavior is extinguished or becomes extinct. You no longer go to work. A discriminative stimulus is a cue for the availability of reinforcement. For example, a child may find that at home, with a newborn baby in the house, he's not reinforced for singing at the top of his lungs. On the other hand, when he goes to Grandma's house, she likes the singing, and he gets reinforcement for singing, whether it's attention or a cookie, whatever works for him. Now, Grandma becomes the discriminative stimulus. He can also generalize from grandma to other older women who may also treat him in a similar way. In other words, they also reinforce his singing, and so he's generalized that older women like little children who sing. Primary reinforcers are universal within a species. They're natural and biological. For example, if an organism is hungry, food would be a natural reinforcer. For an organism who is sleepy, sleep would be a natural reinforcer and could cause an increase in behavior. Secondary reinforcers are learned and vary from individual to individual. Some individuals are reinforced by money. They'll work overtime. Other individuals prefer social reinforcers. Money doesn't work for them. They want to go home. For them, perhaps the social reinforcement might make them more likely to engage in the behavior of leaving work early on occasion, because they really don't care if their paycheck gets docked. They want the socialization. That's reinforcement, learned or secondary reinforcement for them. If you recall, we earlier said that reinforcement is anything which increases a behavior. This is true regardless of whether the reinforcement is positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. Both will increase behavior. Positive reinforcement increases behavior when it's given. A child who's given a treat or a dog who's given a treat for learning to sit up will be more likely to engage in that behavior in the future. Negative reinforcement reinforces or increases a behavior when it's removed. For example, you may have in the past had instructors who, because your behavior was good during the semester, you received good grades, decides to remove the final exam and says you have an A average or a B average, you no longer have to take the final. This is negative reinforcement. It's increased a behavior by its removal. So basically, positive reinforcement involves giving something pleasurable or good and increasing a behavior. Negative reinforcement involves removing something bad in order to increase a behavior, removing an unpleasant stimulus. That was objective number 6. Explain the difference between positive and negative reinforcement. Objective number 7 asks you to define punishment and summarize the factors that influence its effectiveness. As you recall, punishment is anything which suppresses behavior. There are a number of factors which influence the effectiveness of punishment. To begin with, in order to be effective, punishment must be consistent. You have a very high crime rate if very seldom are criminals caught and sent to jail. If the arrest and conviction rate are low, criminal behavior is high. Punishment needs to be consistent. Every time, or at least almost every time, it needs to be punished. The punishment needs to occur immediately after a behavior. For mom to say, wait until dad gets home and you're going to get punished for this, is not nearly as effective for a small child as having the punishment occur immediately after they commit the misbehavior. In addition, punishment only teaches a person what not to do. It doesn't tell them what they can do in order to get the reinforcement that they need. For example, if a child is acting up in order to get attention, you need to teach the child another method for getting the attention that he seeks and needs. So you need to combine punishment with reinforcement for an alternate behavior that might receive the same attention that he wants. If mom's doing the laundry, for example, reinforcing or providing attention to a child who's helpful, who helps fold the laundry or sort the laundry, is much more effective in encouraging the kind of behavior you desire, rather than punishing a child for causing trouble every time mom's focused on the laundry in order to get her attention. Objective number 8 asks you to define behavior modification. Behavior modification is a systematic application of the principles of conditioning to changing behavior. It's frequently used in an institutional setting such as a school, a prison, a juvenile detention facility. A token economy is a particularly effective way of using behavior modification because it takes into account the concept that different people are reinforced by different things. In this case, good behavior is reinforced with tokens, generic tokens like chips or tickets. These chips or tickets can later be exchanged for something that that particular individual finds of value. For example, they may decide to exchange their tokens for time on a video game or time watching television, or they might decide to exchange their tokens for some particular candy or food that they like particularly well, or time using a cell phone. Objective number 9 asks you to define observational learning. As its name suggests, observational learning is learning that occurs through observing or imitating the behavior of others. This can be behavior that's observed on television. It can be behavior that's observed by watching a model and deliberately attempting to imitate their actions. So it can be deliberate or non-deliberate, but basically it's learning through the process of watching someone else do something. That concludes Section 2. This was objective number 6. Explain the difference between positive and negative reinforcement.